Now we got it.
All good.
So Stu asked me to talk about the history of J virus because I was kind of involved in this whole thing. As he told you, I'm Bob Owen. I like to tell everybody I'm full of character because as I was going through this, everybody said this is going to build character. Well, I think when you hear this story, you're going to find out that I'm probably even a bigger character than Stu is. And as Stu told you, I am currently retired and enjoying life. And that is until he called me and asked me to take this trip down memory lane. But actually, it was a good trip because I never had taken the opportunity to step back and look at the big picture of what happened with J virus and how we dealt with it and really kind of put all the pieces together. So this really did turn out to be a good experience. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the enemy that we faced and the myriad of challenges that we faced in dealing with J virus, the timeline of what happened, why it happened, and how we took care of it. And lastly, we'll talk about the happy endings. Some of them were happy, some were maybe not quite so happy, which is why I put question marks after it. So before the 90s, the retroviral disease that we dealt with was called lymphoid leukosis. That particular virus caused tumors that usually only were seen after sexual maturity. So we never saw anything in the pullet house. It was only when the birds went to the laying house that we'd see it. The manifestation of the disease was big livers and big spleens. And in a flock, it would cause very low mortality. 1 to 2% of the birds we lose because of lymphoid leukosis. There didn't appear to be any immunosuppression with this virus, at least lymphoid leukosis. It affected primarily light breeds, the layers, and we had a little bit going on in the heavy breeds, but we really weren't concerned about it at all. The serogroups of virus that were affected were groups A and B, and we always have group E, which is endogenous virus in the background. And I'll try to teach a little bit about endogenous virus and the challenges it made for us. Things changed in the 90s. In the 90s, we were hit with myeloid leukosis, so we call this disease ML or J virus. When we first started to see the disease, it only occurred after sexual maturity, and the manifestation of the tumors were gray to white cauliflower-looking tumors on the inside of the keel, right in this area here, and we would also see them in the sacrum and around the kidneys. And I will tell you that I cannot look at a picture like this even today without my blood running absolutely cold because of what this virus cost me and did to us. The mortality from myeloid leukosis was more pronounced than we ever saw with lymphoid leukosis. And when everything hit the fan, the mortality really became significant. And with this virus, because of some of the clinical things we were seeing in the field, we conjectured, and I'm not sure anybody ever followed up on it, but we conjectured that there were immunosuppressive effects from this virus, which after all would stand to be reasoned because these are hitting myeloid cells in the bone marrow initially. So it would stand to reason that we had some immunosuppression going on. A little bit of the history of J virus because it kind of all fits in. In 1988, Jim Payne over in the UK did some virus isolation from meat-type chickens. And the chickens that he picked were not having any particular problems. We just at that point didn't know anything about retroviruses in heavy birds. So there weren't any particular tumors or diseases associated with the birds that he took the samples from, and he was actually kind of surprised. He isolated 5 different isolates of an ALV that didn't fit in any of the categories that we knew of. So that work was done in 1988. Jim didn't publish it until 1991. And when he published it, it was in the Journal of Virology, which is not one of the journals that I was prone to reading all the time. So remember those dates, because they're really important in this whole scenario. The prototype virus that he isolated, he called HPRS 103, which we call J virus, which we call ML. So you'll see a variety of different names for this. And in his work, he found that rather than having affinity for cells in the bursa as A and B do, this particular virus had affinity for the myeloid cells in the bone marrow and caused tumors, which were diagnosed pathologically as myeloid leukosis. So he did a bunch of serology and a lot of things that I couldn't even begin to understand, and found that it didn't fall into any of the known serogroups. The ones that affect birds are A, B, C, and D. C and D are not so important. It's really A and B that we think of, or E. H and J were taken, but those don't affect birds. They didn't want to use I as a serogroup, so he got the privilege of naming it J virus. And I shall always regret that this virus was named and we had to deal with it. As we headed down the road of trying to figure out how we were going to deal with what turned out to be almost a nuclear explosion, I had to learn a lot about avian retroviruses. And the good news for things that helped us beat this were that avian retroviruses are relatively difficult to pass on from bird to bird. So, I mean, it's not like an influenza or what everybody is currently so tuned into now, COVID. You know, we don't have aerosol transmission. With this particular virus, it's either vertical transmission or oral fecal. And that makes controlling it in the big scheme of things a lot easier. The virus lasts a fairly short time in the environment. We were worried right at first that our houses were going to be seeded down and yada, yada, yada. And it turns out that this virus really is very short-lived. So it's not like IBD where you seed the house down and have to worry about continual reinfection. Being an envelope virus, it's also very sensitive to disinfectants. So again, it wasn't like CAV where we would get the house seeded down. If we could control what was going on in these birds, we had a really good chance to control the virus within these populations. As we went down through the course of the challenge, we also learned that the clinical effects for this particular virus can be minimized. And one of the sayings that we had then was that, you know, a bad grower could take a good group of birds and make them bad, and a good grower, if he minimized the stress and things on the birds, could take a bad group of birds and make them good. The bad news with avian retroviruses are that they can spread. And vertical transmission of the avian retrovirus is a very, very important factor in the epidemiology of this disease. The virus can also spread chick to chick. As I said, it's not aerosol, but oral fecal is definitely a significant risk factor. The virus, because there were no good diagnostic methods, in the big scheme of things, is very, very difficult to detect. And so when you're headed into an eradication program for a virus, this makes it a really challenging thing. As I said in the good news thing, in the bad news thing, the clinical effects of the virus can be enhanced. If they give up on the birds and don't have practiced good husbandry and stress the birds, a bad situation can be made worse. The other thing that as we were deciding what we were going to do to deal with this virus, that made it very challenging there is, and there still remains today, no effective vaccine for avian retrovirus. And there were none, and currently still are no therapeutics to help ameliorate the effects of the virus. So at the end of the day, when you put it all together, eradication really is the only option that we have for trying to deal with avian retroviruses. Just a little bit about the virus, and I mean, I had to become a pseudo-virologist through this whole thing. It turned out about halfway through, Hubbard, as a matter of fact, hired a molecular retrovirologist to come in and work with things. By that time, we were already pretty well on the way to getting rid of it. So I'm not sure what he ever added to the thing, but he sure knew more about the virus than I did and wanted to do Christmas trees and all the different things that we see nowadays that I still can't interpret. Anyhow, the avian retrovirus is an RNA virus. This particular virus carries its own reverse transcriptase, so that as the virus comes in and loses its envelope, the reverse transcriptase translates the RNA of the virus into DNA, which then becomes incorporated into the DNA of the particular cell that it infects. And as I said, in this, it was primarily myeloid cells. Important in this whole big picture of avian retroviruses and what we had to deal with J virus is, if this DNA gets incorporated into a primordial germ cell line or stem cells, then they can make endogenous viruses. And endogenous viruses are they just made this the hardest thing in the world to try to deal with. There's 3 important proteins that play in this. There's a group-specific protein that's common to all avian retroviruses. It's called P27. There was a serotype-specific protein, and this was the different protein that made J virus so that it didn't fit into any category but its own. In J virus, it's P85. And then, as I already mentioned, reverse transcriptase. Let's visit for a minute about endogenous retroviruses. All species of animals, including human beings, carry endogenous virus in their genome. And as I said, it occurs when proviral DNA incorporates into the stem cells and then gets passed on from generation to generation. These little pieces of DNA that get incorporated really have 3 fates. One, and the most frequent fate, is they become just blind pieces of DNA in the genome. They never get translated, they never cause any problems, and nobody ever really notices that they're there. The second fate is that can be translated, some of it can be partially translated and yield recognizable gene products. In this particular virus, the most frequently expressed gene product is, as I said, P27. The third fate is it can be fully translated, and we can end up with endogenous virus particles, but the best knowledge we had at the time was they're not pathogenic and they're not capable of causing disease. So we didn't need to worry about the endogenous creating more issues for us, but it sure made diagnosis complicated. The number of endogenous viruses varies very significantly by breed of bird. And the leghorn breeds of birds really don't have many endogenous viruses. The heavy breeds that we dealt with had anywhere from 5 to over 100 endogenous viruses in their genome. And so dealing with avian retroviruses was very different for the heavy breeds of birds than they were for the light breeds of birds. And I just threw this last line in, you know, we talk about xenotransplantation. It's my understanding that one of the biggest concerns is, like, if you transplant a pig heart into a human being, what would happen if the endogenous viruses in that pig heart started to become active in the human? And we just really don't know the answer to that question. So the challenge with this whole thing, for myself as a veterinarian for a primary breeder, is I had to come up with an efficient, cost-effective diagnosis of birds infected with exogenous avian retroviruses. So we had to separate the endogenous from the exogenous, because remember I said, I mean, they could have up to 20 endogenous viruses in here. And so if you start getting birds out of the population with endogenous virus in them, you're going to decimate your population and you won't have enough breeding birds and you lose the genetic potential of that line. So being able to separate endogenous from exogenous was the name of the game with all the work that we did with the avian retroviruses. I throw this in just so that everybody is reminded of the poultry breeding pyramid in heavy breeds of birds. We had our elite birds up in Walpole, New Hampshire. These are pedigreed lines that the geneticists did their selection and retained the best of the best, and then passed the second selects and not unneeded progeny off to a great-grandparent generation. Most of these birds, we had a good many in New Hampshire. Most of our GGP production was down in North Carolina. The next generation was just grandparent birds. It was just merely a blow-up generation so that we could produce enough eggs in order to meet orders and things like that. What we sold to our customers in the United States and some internationally was parent stock birds. These are the breeders that are in the laying houses for the companies that purchase the product. And obviously the broilers are the progeny that end up on the shelf in the grocery store. Each one of these generations takes about a year. And so from any time that we do anything up in the elite birds until changes are reflected in the broilers, you're talking about a period of 4 to 5 years, which makes it a whole different game when you're trying to deal with this vertically transmitted virus. The biggest challenge was diagnostic methods. There really are 4 diagnostic methods available for this virus. At the time, now this was the early 90s. At the time of the early 90s, there really were only 2, direct ELISA and virus isolation. PCR was really just starting to be learned about and utilized. And there was no antibody testing. And during the course of this whole scenario, we at Hubbard really pushed, it was especially IDEX that rose to the challenge to develop an antibody test for us, because I thought that would be a really good monitoring tool. As it turns out, IDEX did a hell of a job of developing the antibody test, but it really turned out to be a useless test, which I'll show you in just a minute. So let's first talk about direct ELISA. And I had to start with a story. I was in China, and I was in Harbin, China, visiting with people from the Harbin University. And we were talking about the woes that we were going through, and this university professor got a little smile on his face and he says, well, I know exactly what you need to do to test and get rid of this virus. And I said, well, you know, then would you please share it with me, because I got to get this thing fixed. And he got a little smile on his face and he says, no, he says, that's proprietary information. At which point the interpreter that was with me had to get me up and out of the room because I was going to hit the guy. It turned out what he was talking about, though, was this feather pulp test. And feather pulp was kind of the key test that we use in the leghorn industry. Remember, the leghorns don't have endogenous virus levels that we do in the broiler breeder industry. And so it was a good test for the leghorns, but it was a useless test for us. Anyhow, with direct ELISA, there's a variety of samples you can use: albumin, cloacal, vaginal, meconium, and we tried them all. The advantage of this direct ELISA is, I mean, if you can get the ELISA plates, it's widely available. The ELISA plates are relatively inexpensive, and you can have the results of the test quickly. What we learned very early on is the disadvantage is it only means that GP27 is present, because that's what the ELISA plate is detecting. It doesn't tell you anything about the origin of the P27. Was it an endogenous P27 that was being elaborated, or was it really from an exogenous virus? So for us, direct ELISA was absolutely useless for an eradication program. We did think for a while that it could be used as a flock screening tool. We kind of never got to it because we were so busy with everything else. But the theory behind it is if it's just endogenous P27, if you monitor the flock over time, the levels of P27 should remain relatively stable. If it's an exogenous virus that's multiplying within the flock, over time the P27 levels should increase. It's probably good in theory. In practice, we never really utilized it. And this is some work we did early on trying to convince ourselves. So this is the same group of birds, and you can see, remember, I'm trying to detect birds with the exogenous virus because I don't want to decimate the genetic populations. So this particular group of birds, we did virus isolation and got a 0% prevalence. But look, if we'd used direct ELISA, albumin gave us 4.5%, cloaca 1.5%, meconium, and the worst test for us was feather pulp. If we'd used direct ELISA on feather pulp, we'd have removed 40% of the birds in the population, and we wouldn't have been able to preserve our genetics. So the gold standard is virus isolation, and this was the foundation of our program. If you're using C-bar-E cells, the virus isolation will only allow exogenous to grow, and we'll talk about C-bar-E in a little bit. The advantages, it's a very sensitive test, and it's a very specific test. The disadvantages is, now this is back in the early 90s, you can only imagine what it would cost now. Then we estimated it was $5 a sample. And it's a long time until you get results. And that has implications for whether you're trying to do an eradication program or a reduction program. As I said, it's non-specific, and with C-bar-E, you only know it's exogenous. And so as we went through things, we realized that, you know, in doing this, we weren't only going to eradicate J virus, we were also going to eradicate the A and B subgroups that were in our lines, because it's just detecting P27, it's not detecting any serotype-specific protein. Jim Payne, as he did further work with J virus, finally came to the conclusion that the event that happened to form J virus was a recombination event between an endogenous virus and an exogenous virus. And so it stands to reason that if we get rid of the exogenous virus, we may be able to stop another J virus from coming on at some point in time in the future. The disadvantage was, in order to really be a pure test, you need C-bar-E cells. Well, C-bar-E cells at that time, and probably is still true, were only available from a line of chickens out at the Avian Disease and Oncology Laboratory called the Line 0 birds. And so, as you'll see with the numbers that I give you, those birds just couldn't produce enough eggs for all of us who are trying to do virus isolation. Bill Chase was supposed to be starting a Line 0 production flock out in Iowa, and that really never came to fruition, so we didn't have that as a source of cells. ADOL was trying to develop a continuous line of cells called the DF1, and that never panned out to be useful. So what we were left with was using cells from SPOPHIS that were listed as mostly C-bar-E, although it wasn't a perfect thing, and it complicated our testing a good bit. Another disadvantage of virus isolation requires a skilled staff. You know, you got laminar flow hoods, sterile technique, primary cell culture. It requires relatively sophisticated people to be able to do this. As I said, it's relatively expensive, $5 a sample, and the turnaround time. We figured from the time that we drew the blood sample from the birds until we got the results was a minimum of 10 days. And so this has some really profound implications if you're doing an eradication program, because you don't know what happened with that virus in that population in the 10 days you were waiting to get the results back to take care of it. And that was a very, very big deciding factor in what I put in place for our eradication program. And this is just a sample of some of our virus isolation results. We would do random samples at 17 weeks of age. This particular flock, we had 22% positive. 22% was our trigger. If it was over 5%, it was our trigger to go do 100% virus isolation. So at 19 weeks, we went in and did 100%. We took out 14.5% of the birds. Monitored again at 28 weeks, and you can see, and this is probably as good as it gets. You know, we got them down under 5%, but there's no way in the world, because of the way that virus moves around in 10 days, that you're going to be able to test a flock to negative. And so we felt good if we were able to take it down to under 5%. Monitored again at 37 weeks. And then the interesting thing, and this is a consistent thing we saw, look at 46 and 54 weeks of age. What happened is the virus took care of itself because of the mortality that it caused in the flock. So one very frustrating thing to me through this whole thing was, of course, because all that was going on in the breeding industry, broiler eggs became short, and the price of meat went up dramatically. I mean, to the point that after we got rid of J virus, I actually had people who asked me to bring it back because they weren't making as much money. But one thing I would try to convince them of is if you could bring a flock in at 21 weeks of age and just discard the eggs until the flock is like 35 or 37 weeks of age, then the virus would pretty well have taken care of itself by killing the highly infected birds and getting them out of the flock. Of course, the industry being what it was, that would never happen because they needed the broilers because the price of meat was so high. And so the rule for setting eggs back then was if they didn't fall through the flats, the egg was getting set and they were going to try and make a chick out of it, which of course created additional issues at the broiler level. I won't talk much about PCR. We made a choice early on not to use it. We didn't have the technology or knowledge. I think in today's world, it probably would be an important tool that we could use. In me having to make the decisions for this, the biggest thing I was worried about is the propensity for false negatives. If I was doing all this work, I wanted to take my best chance at not missing any birds in the population. And so PCR was not part of our eradication program. The molecular retrovirologists they hired used it some in some additional monitoring programs, but it was not a part of our eradication program. Antibodies, I said, we pushed IDEXX hard to develop an antibody test, and they developed one. And it was marked as an anti-J antibody test kit. And I thought, hallelujah, this is going to be a salvation. It turned out, as we learned about the whole thing, it actually wasn't an anti-J, it was an anti-GP85 antibody test kit. And GP85, as it turns out, is also an endogenous protein that can be elaborated and create immune response in the birds. So that as we looked at more and more flocks with this antibody kit, the interpretation of the results became very, very difficult. And so I used it some because in some instances it was clear cut. But this is an example of some of the results. I mean, I have no problem calling this flock an antibody positive flock. And I have no problem calling this flock an antibody negative flock. But what do you do with a flock like this, especially if you get more moving up the axis here? And that really is just GP85 that they're mounting an immune response to, and really doesn't help you tell what the J virus status of that flock is. So kudos to IDEXX for developing the test. Unfortunately, it just turned out to be a dead end for us. So Hubbard made the decision early on that virus isolation was going to be our test method of choice. And off we went. So what's the virus isolation procedure? Now, remember this in the context of our flock sizes at the GP and GGP level were anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 birds. So the virus isolation procedure, individually identify each bird. Then collect blood samples labeled for the identity of the bird in Alcevor solution because we wanted the Buffy coat. Bring it back under ice, centrifuge to collect the Buffy coat, that was just our name for the white blood cells. Prepare the primary chick embryo fibroblast cell cultures using the C-bar-E eggs that I talked about. Once we get confluent growth in the cell cultures, plate with the Buffy coat, incubate the cell culture and refeed it a couple of times over the next 7 days. At the end of 7 days, you take and freeze and thaw, take the supernatant, run ELISA for GP27, report the results, and then you got to go back in the flock with the paper that says your results, find the individual birds that reported as positive, and remove them from the flock. So I think you can imagine what a procedure this was. So during all this, there was a referendum being voted on in California. And my dear friend in Canada would go to California and would take pictures of slides like this and send them to me and laugh about what I was going through. I think this was a healthcare referendum that they had, but he also took pictures of J street signs, and at one point I had a whole collection of the pictures courtesy of Dr. Ritchie. So here's the numbers, folks. In 1998, we did 1.47 million virus isolations. The weekly high for our laboratory was 45,000 samples. We were using 30 to 40 embryos per week. We were having an awful time getting SPF embryos in order to do the work. Remember when they first brought the Pfizer vaccine out, it had to be held at ultra low temperatures. At one point in time, we had a whole room of ultra low temperatures that we could have sold them. We had at least 12 ultra low freezers to hold these peripheral blood monocytes because we had to hold them at ultra low so we were sure we wouldn't lose the virus. They took an old egg facility and put 30 laminar flow hoods in that were being used 24/7. And my laboratory manager, a gentleman by the name of Dale Woodward, who I will always worship the ground he walked on, did this all with only 4 trained med techs and 30 people that Dale brought off of the street and trained to do cell culture and sterile technique. I mean, anybody who's ever done cell culture and sterile technique knows what a monumental task that is in order to train people off the street not to contaminate all of your cell cultures and have all the work that you've done just fall apart in front of you. Hubbard owes Dale Woodward a debt of gratitude that will never be repaid. I can remember when we first headed down the road, he picked up the phone and called colleagues and tried to tell them the decisions that we were going to make and what we were going to do. And all he got at the other end of the screen was laughing. The identification was another big issue. I mean, obviously, when we started, all we had were wingbands. And so we started wingbanding all these birds. And then we'd have to go back and individually read the wingbands. And we ran the wingband companies out of wingbands and had trouble getting them. And then somebody turned us on to using those garment tags that you see in all the shirts and things that you buy that you can never get off, the little plastic bar and tag. And so we got garment tags with barcodes. And so eventually when they went back into the flock, the barcodes, when we put the results in the computer, would be coded, and all the people had to do was scan the barcode and they get either green light or red light, which told them if that bird was positive and needed to be removed from the flock or was negative and could remain in the flock. So we learned a lot as we went on, but boy, it was labor intensive and really arduous as we went through the whole thing. The timeline, I couldn't figure out any cute way to do this timeline. So we're just going to go through it in kind of this blundering fashion that I have developed. It all starts in 1988. August of 1988, I have records from Hubbard R&D farms that showed that line 51 was testing 6.1% for avian retrovirus. Remember, 88 is when Jim Payne was doing this work, so we didn't even know about J virus at that point in time. But they were looking for avian retroviruses. Well, it turns out that a very dear friend and colleague that you all know, a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Glisson, used to call J virus the disease of thieves, because there is this phenomenon in the industry of shared genetics. It turns out, though, that Hubbard wasn't even smart enough to steal the virus. The line of chickens that Jim Payne isolated these viruses from came from a breeder company over in the UK called Marshall. And it's my understanding that Marshall went to sell some of its genetic lines, and they were offered to both Ross and Hubbard. And so rather than stealing it, we actually bought it and brought the J virus in, we think, on this line of birds. And then it went nuts from that. We moved to December 1988. Further surveillance, you can see line 51's up at 11% now. Line 52, which was a cross between 51 and one of their internal lines, is at 19%. Lines 3, 10, and 2 are female lines, so the female lines are still clean here. Line 58 was another male line that was housed with these lines, and see that one's at 9.1%. Remember, this is 1988. This is before we even knew what J virus was. 1992, September 1, 1992, some stupid newly minted PhD and his family arrive in the perfect quintessential New England town of Walpole, New Hampshire. And I want to tell you, if you ever get the opportunity to visit Walpole, New Hampshire, go there, because it is one of the most beautiful places on the face of the earth. Other than the fact that the winters are very long and very cold, it was just a wonderful place to live. So Hubbard really took a chance on me, because when I arrived at Hubbard, I'd come out of dairy practice, and I really only knew infectious bronchitis because that was my master's thesis, and ascites because that was my PhD dissertation. I didn't know how to write a vaccination program or do a cocci check or anything. So, I mean, I had a big learning curve, and I had some very, very wonderful friends and colleagues who helped me learn things. I will never forget, Stu Ritchie and I took our boards the same year, and we went up to Guelph for a training session, and we spent the whole day sitting in an auditorium with John Barnes. Back in those days, you used slides in a carousel, and John Barnes had like 10 carousels of slides, and all day long it's just click, click, click with different lesions. And by the end of the day, our brains are just absolutely fried. And at the end of the day, old Stu hits me in the side, and he looks at me and says, "Bob," he says, "our job sucks." I said, "Why would you say that, Stu?" He says, "Our job sucks." He said, "Did you ever sit in a bar and try and pick up the girl sitting next to you, and she asked you what you do for a living?" He said, "You cut up dead chickens." Well, that kind of is the essence of the whole thing, I guess. But this was my trial by fire, because 1993, January, we had a male line flock at the GP level that broke with tumors. And the tumors broke after we administered that flock. We were using a killed AE vaccination back at that point in time. And so I took tumors and sent for histopathology. I always used Penn State and ADOL for my histopathology. and the diagnosis came back as myelocytomatosis. Remember, this is early 93. Jim Payne had published on J virus in January and not in the middle of 1991 in the Journal of Virology, which was not our normal reading. So we really didn't know what we were dealing with. And Patty Dunn, who's always been my guiding light and histopathologist, kept asking for me to take samples of nerve and samples of bursa because we were trying to decide whether we were dealing with Merrick's disease or avian leukosis. And I mean, we were really just chasing our tails. We did send samples out to ADOL for virus isolation. And I will tell you that Dick Witter and Ollie Fadley were a tremendous amount of help to us through these early years in trying to sort things out. Unfortunately, being a government laboratory, they didn't tend to work with the kind of urgency that we needed in industry. So sometimes the results didn't come back in quite as fast a timely fashion as we needed them to. 94, now we're starting to see it more. These are GP flocks. Again, PSU and ADOL diagnosed that it was ML or myelocytomatosis. And I think it was 94 that the article for Jim Payne finally came to light, and we figured out that this was probably J virus that we were dealing with. So we went down and we tested 3 of our grandparent flocks, didn't find any virus there. This was a male line of the high Y, and we found low virus prevalence there. And up on R&D, in this line, we found a low virus prevalence there. So we have indications that it's spreading a little bit, but it wasn't a disaster yet. By 94, by October, we got back finally some serology results, and we knew we weren't dealing with A, B, C, or D. We knew we were dealing with J. Of course, nobody had any antigens to really tell for sure that it was J virus at that point in time, but by process of elimination, we figured it was J virus. And at that point in time, on the advice from ADOL, we switched our virus isolation from cloacal swabs to doing the peripheral blood monocytes because we felt that was a much more sensitive sample to be using for the virus isolation. 95, May of 95, male landline eradication program put into place. Not many people who look at that statement realize the importance of that statement. Some rocket scientists, geneticists who shall remain nameless, at that point in time, we were sending them consistent positive results from these male lines. And in their infinite wisdom, because they didn't want to cost themselves genetics, the positive birds, rather than being eliminated from the population, were just being demoted to the GGP population. So in fact, what was happening, because they didn't want to kill any birds, they were enriching the production populations, which ended up being what we were going to have to deal with. So in May 1995, we finally won the battle, and any positive birds were euthanized. We were getting them out of the population. Later that year, we also added another test. Early in 95, we're only doing 1 test during the life of the flock. Later on, we realized that that wasn't cutting it, so we added a 2nd test. And Stu kept sending me pictures of signs that he took from California. 1997 was the year the wheels came off, okay? And remember the timeline here. So it was 1988 that we had the first glimmers. So it took 10 years for this virus to really spread in these populations and become clinically significant. But let me tell you, when it did, the wheels came off. January 97, in our own flocks, we started to see production issues in GP flocks in Arkansas. And the production issues were things that we didn't usually see. We'd see capillary infection, ascarids, crop mycosis, all kind of signs that this virus was really on top of giving us tumors, was also causing some immunosuppression that was allowing these other diseases to rear their ugly heads. We also, in our monitoring program, began to see significantly increasing prevalence of virus in our male lines up in New Hampshire. April of 1997 was the index case of problems at customer level. We got a call from Central and South America, and Clyde Honeycutt and I went down there and got absolutely beat up on GP populations and parent stock populations in Central America. Just classic immunosuppression and tumors all over the place. This was really kind of the first sign we had of any issues at the customer level. And remember, this was the breeder level, which you would expect the retroviruses to be operating at. But this was really the first time we had issues at the customer level. July of 1997, I was given the privilege by Hubbard of an all-expense-paid trip to India. And I want to tell you, that was quite a trip. On top of having to travel with armed guards because there were so many pissed off people there, I got the privilege of contracting giardiasis. So that's not something that I want to keep remembering. The end of the month was the AAAP meeting, and it was the debut of the Primary Breeders Roundtable. The Primary Breeders Roundtable consisted of me calling Gregorio Rosales, who was with Ross at the time, and we knew that it wasn't just Hubbard that was having this issue. And I said, Greg, let's all get together and talk about this. So that's what we did, and that was the formation of the Primary Breeders Roundtable, which actually is an organization that is still in existence and operational today. August of 1997, two things happened. We, at that point in time, were a wholly owned subsidiary of Merck, and Santa Fe had its own animal health section, which had shaver broilers and also some layer lines. Well, Merck and Santa Fe didn't want to be involved in the animal agriculture industry anymore, so they decided to merge and form Mario Animal Health. Well, August of 1997 was when the due diligence and everything was all done. Everything was clean, no problems, so they announced the merger and the formation of Mario Animal Health. August of 1997 was also the second meeting of the Primary Breeders Roundtable, and that was kind of an interesting meeting because Gregorio and I both knew that we had J virus. Guillermo Zavala from AVIAN knew it. Bruce Singbile was with Peterson at the time, and Peterson, until they went to their yield type male, really didn't have issues with it. Remember the phenomenon of shared genetics. Kenny Powell was the veterinarian for Cobb, and he showed up at the meeting in July, and he said, well, I don't know what you all are talking about. He said, but I thought I'd come learn about this. Well, he came in August with his tail tucked between his legs, and he said, well, you know, I went back and I started to look at some of the mortality, and I'm seeing those cauliflower tumors that you guys are talking about. So really the only breed of bird that wasn't affected with J virus was Arbor Acres, and Nick Dorco was the veterinarian for them. The reason for that was because Monty Frazier was the original primary breeder vet for Arbor Acres, and Monty had what he called his 3-in-3 quarantine procedure for bringing genetics onto their R&D farms. Any genetics to come on their R&D farms needed to be housed at least 3 miles away from any R&D facility and stay away from the R&D facility for at least 3 generations. Hubbard at the time had what I affectionately call our 5 or 50 guarantee. If the geneticist wanted to bring new genetics in, the quarantine would either be 5 minutes or 50 feet inside the door. And that really didn't help with what we were trying to achieve with J virus. September of 1997, in the words of Franklin Roosevelt, a month that shall live in infamy. Just before Labor Day, my phone rang. It was Dr. Marshall Putnam, who's now with SIVA. Back then, he was head vet for Wayne Farms, and he called because of performance issues and tumors in high Y broilers. This was the first report that I had of any issues at the broiler level. So I spent Labor Day down in Coleman, Alabama with Marshall Putnam looking at these birds. And in fact, we were starting to see J virus elaborate itself at the broiler level. Tumors, not so much, but it was the immunosuppression. And you could go look at a group of broilers that were pretty heavily infected with J virus, and they had what we would call the look. They just weren't good looking birds because they were sick. After I was down there, I came back, and September 5th, we had a whole R&D meeting about how we were going to eradicate and control this up on our PURELINEs. And I was charged with the mission of figuring out what we were going to do. September 9th, we went to a production meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, and had the same discussion about what we were going to do with our production flocks. And I flew from Boston to Atlanta. This production meeting was in Atlanta, and I was due to go on to Sao Paulo, Brazil, because I was due to go on and visit Resende. And while we're in the middle of this meeting, Vaughn King received a fax, and he handed it to me and said, "I think this was from you." It was from John Gascoigne, who was then president of Hubbard, saying I was needed immediately in China. So without a Chinese visa in my passport, I went from Atlanta down to Sao Paulo, spent a couple of days with Resende, and then flew from Sao Paulo to Paris, Paris to Beijing, spent a week in Beijing, back to Tokyo, and then back to Boston. So I literally had the opportunity of flying completely around the world, which is not something that I care to do again. September 30th was probably the turning point of this whole thing. I called what I called our task force, and we had our task force meeting. In this task force, there were a variety of Hubbard people, but the three most important people that I invited were Dr. Bill Chase, who at that point in time was retired from Highline and running an airline delivery service because Bill always loved to fly, Dr. John Glisson from the University of Georgia, and Dr. Guillermo Zavala, who I think was probably right then transitioning from Avian Farms to UGA. And the other one was Chuck Hoffaker. We sat for a whole day, and everybody put all the cards on the table. And it was as a result of this meeting that the decisions about what we were going to do about J virus were made. October of 1997, I got called to Rahway, New Jersey. Anybody who doesn't know what Rahway, New Jersey is, it's the headquarters of Merck. So by this time, it had come to light that nobody had bothered while they were doing the due diligence to tell anybody who was doing the due diligence about what was going on with J virus in our genetic populations of birds. I got called to Rahway, New Jersey, and it was not a very pleasant or a very long meeting. What I was told was I only had one line on my job description. It was to get rid of J virus. They didn't care what it cost because it was putting this whole merger that was forming Marielle in jeopardy. So you want to talk about having a weight on your shoulders. So I stepped back and came up with a plan. And my reasoning was when we had the task force meeting, probably the smartest decision I made was inviting Bill Chase, because Bill Chase had led the effort at Highline to get rid of serotypes A and B. And I remember very vividly, Bill Chase charged us $1,000 for the consultation fee for that day, which back in that time was a horrendous fee. But I paid it very happily because he laid it all out for us. And the decisions that I made was, even though J virus behaved differently clinically than A and B, it was a retrovirus. And so I followed Bill Chase's lead, and in our R&D, we divided our genetic lines into small groups. And what we charged the geneticists with, because at that point in time, we had some ideas about the prevalence in each individual line, is the group size is defined by the prevalence, so that, you know, if we have to discard a group, it's not going to devastate the genetics in that line. And the rule was, if one animal in the group was positive, the entire group was euthanized. And we put a whole bunch of biosecurity measures in. Each pen had different boots and alcohol hand washes, and we did our best to keep it from transmitting from pen to pen. We decided in production we would work to decrease the prevalence. And I showed you some of those virus isolation results. We decided it was all going to be virus isolation, and it was all going to be peripheral blood monocytes, and told the laboratory to be prepared to do 30,000 samples per week. And that's when Dale Woodward swung into action. January 1998, we kicked her in gear. We went from 10,000 samples per week to 30,000 per week. Now, to put this in perspective, the first time we went out to ADOL and Dick Witter and Ollie Fadley talked to us, you know, they offered to do some testing for us to try to help us figure out what was going on. And I was figuring that, you know, they would do 500 samples for us. When they came back to us with the proposal, they wanted 5 samples. And so, I mean, we've gone from 5 samples to now we're doing 30,000 per week. It was a big undertaking. I put this in just because by this time, as you can imagine, some of the upper management at Hubbard was not particularly happy with me, because I was fighting a war and I was going to beat this disease, and I didn't care who I pissed off. And so while Dale Woodward was putting the program in place and making it happen, I was kind of sent on a worldwide tour of getting my butt kicked by various pissed off customers. And so in June of 1998, I was afforded the opportunity of an all-expensive paid trip to Israel, followed by Pakistan. And if you ever tried to convince the immigration facilities in Israel why you want to go to Pakistan, that's a major undertaking. I landed in Islamabad, Pakistan at about 1 o'clock in the morning. My flight to Karachi wasn't until 7 o'clock in the morning. And you want to talk about one scared fat gringo sitting there smoking cigarettes all night long in the Islamabad airport waiting for that flight. I landed in Karachi and immediately put me in a car, and we went up into the mountains of Pakistan. And if y'all remember the town that Osama bin Laden was finally killed in, was a town in Pakistan called Abbottabad. Well, Dr. Owen's been to Abbottabad posting chickens. And I mean, who knows, they may have been Osama bin Laden's chickens that I looked at. So I got to see a lot of things. And for the rest of that year, the world tour continued. I mean, I went everywhere trying to deal with upset people. And the one thing that I will say, though, in Hubbard's credit, and one thing I've always been very appreciative of, is I was never involved in any financial negotiations with customers. I don't know what arrangements were made for birds or money exchange or anything. Hubbard told me that I was a technical expert and I was to keep it as technical expert. And that's always the way it stayed. And I've always been very grateful for that, because I was always able to maintain my professional credibility. The PURELINE program that we put up in Walpole, that's where eradication, we knew eradication had to happen up there. If we didn't get it up there, we could never get it in our lower populations. So we did the small groups. We did 100% virus isolation at 8, 18, and 27 weeks of age. And then just before they went into the pedigree program. Again, if one bird was found in the group, the whole group was discarded. As we got things cleaned up, these low SP values, the low GP27 values, presented a diagnostic challenge. They were probably coming through because we didn't have a good source of completely C-bar-E eggs. So there was some background stuff that was being detected, and it always caused a lot of consternation about, well, do we get rid of that group or not? A lot of times we'd isolate them and retest them to see what was happening, but these low S&Ps caused a real problem for us in finally cleaning the thing up. Production, we did 400 random samples at 12 and 18 weeks of age. After the birds were housed in the breeder farm, they were monitored monthly. If the flock was above 5%, we did 100% virus isolation. And on these production populations, we did some antibody testing, and the virology department was doing some PCR on these low S&Ps. We eventually got it down to, if it was greater than 2%, we just get rid of the flock. One thing we learned, which I think is another thing that I've seen with watching what's happening with COVID, if it was less than 5%, that virus just didn't have a chance to spread very rapidly through a flock. If it was over 5%, then it was Katie bar the door, and that flock, there was nothing you could do. You could try to clean it up a little bit, but what you really should be doing is sending it down the road. But you can't do that because you gotta, we still did have some orders left. We didn't lose all our business. So here are the numbers. January 98, we had 102 flocks on the ground. Of the 102, we only had 12 negative, and the average prevalence was 12%. A year later, we had half the flocks that were negative, and it dramatically reduced the prevalence in the flocks that were remaining. May of that year, we made a lot more progress, and the virus was on the run. July of that year, the flocks were negative. If we look at the male lines were always the biggest problem and have continued to be the biggest problem. These are just different male lines, but you can see January 98, we're running prevalences of 22, 12, 19, 16. By January 99, now we have the number of negative flocks. We didn't have any negative flocks there. Now we're starting to see some negative flocks with a dramatically reduced prevalence. And by June of 99, we got the virus beat back in the male line flocks. Our Hubbard standard, this was our Hubbard breeder pullet. And in this chart, I would categorize as if they're less than 5%, 10%, or over 10%. You can see in January, the vast majority of the flocks were over 10% prevalence of virus. By September, we'd taken it to about half the flocks were less than 5%. This was the testing and removing. By January of 99, we had half negative and half less than 5%. And by May of 99, everything was negative. Our high Y, same story. The GGPs, same timeline. January 98 to 99, we took it from 6% prevalence down to negative. And so this is what really allowed us to move so rapidly at eradicating this virus down on production. We immediately started to see results up at the PURELINE level. And so we would start feeding those clean birds down into the GGP level, and then we would skip generations and we would move those birds right into the GP level. So from the clean stuff up in New Hampshire, because we'd lost so many orders and our number of flocks were decreased, we had the ability to really start pushing those negative birds down to the GP level so we could start supplying our customers with clean parent stock orders, which of course is exactly what our customers wanted us to do. Same story with female lines. This is the high Y, this is the Hubbard breeder pullet. You can see in January, we only had 5 high Y flocks that were negative and no Hubbard breeder pullet flocks that were negative. By the next year, we were starting to get some negative flocks on the ground. And of course, everybody wanted sourced only from negative flocks. And unfortunately, the communications sometimes weren't quite as good as they should, and the customer would promise it and the hatchery wouldn't do it, and then guess who had to go talk to the customer? So these weren't the most pleasant days of my life. Did we see effects in production? We sure did. This is early mortality on our farms. You can see in 98, when this virus was at its peak, the early mortality. Look at the reduction we saw by the next year when we started to clean things up. Our pullet mortality, again, this is 98, and after we started to clean it up, significant drop in mortality. Life of flock mortality. Now, so this is 97. This is before it blew up. And then this is 98 after it blew up. You can see what it did to the mortality as that virus really took a hold. And this was 99. I didn't get numbers for out here, but we saw a significant reduction in 99. Performance, we got more eggs. I'm often asked the question of what did this virus do to the industry? I guess I'm not really supposed to say agri-stats, but this is hen mortality. And you can see the year 1998, look what happened to the hen mortality. And this is not just Hubbard birds, this is across the industry. Because Ross was having issues with it, Avian was having issues with it. I'll never forget one day towards the end of the whole thing, I was living in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and went to some breeder houses down in Dalton, Georgia. And by this time, I mean, I was just very shell-shocked from people cursing at me and crying and carrying on. And I get off in this, out and putting my coveralls on in this breeder farm, and this big guy comes up to me, and I'm thinking, oh no, here it comes, I'm gonna die. And the guy grabs a hold of me and he gives me a bear hug, and he looks at me and says, Doc, he says, I just want to tell you, a dead Hubbard will lay more eggs than a live avian any day. And that's probably my bright spot in that whole 2 years. Hatchability, you can see it affected the males as much as it did the females, and look what it did to hatchability through this period of time. Livability, yeah, it hit the broiler level. There's no doubt about that. And we would actually see frank tumors in the broiler level, which was unheard of and unreported for any avian retroviruses before then. This was a nasty virus. We think what may have happened is at least the Hubbard virus was a lot more aggressive than the viruses in the others. And our hypothesis was that we picked up a helper virus somewhere along the line that made the Hubbard a lot more pathogenic, the Hubbard virus a lot more pathogenic than the retroviruses that would in some of the other breeder companies. I don't know whether that's true or not. We never followed up on it to find out. Happy endings. On July 19th, 1999, I called John Gascoigne, as I said, was the president of Hubbard, and told him the last positive flock was being sold on Monday. This was a Friday. To date, to the best of my knowledge, there never has been another positive virus isolation for Hubbard birds. I can remember several years after that, I was out in Minnesota at Golden Plump with a young broiler manager, just a young kid. Broiler managers are usually grizzled old men, but this was a young kid. We had a whole good day of the thing. And at the end of the day, I looked at him and I said, son, I said, can I ask you a question? And he said, sure. I said, if I say the words J virus to you, do you have any idea what I'm talking about? And the guy said, no, sir. He said, I never heard of that. Well, the wind went out of my sails, and I was telling Stu about that. And he said, Bob, he said, you just don't understand. He said, you really did your job well, because it's not something that anybody can remember. But I mean, thanks to Stu for letting me do this, because not many people remember the pain that we went through in doing this. Shortly after we got rid of our last positive flock, we kept getting diagnoses of J virus back. And we called that epidemic a diagnosis, which is kind of the thing that's going on with leg problems in turkeys right now in retrovirus. You got to be sure what your diagnosis is, because not every tumor or every collection of lymphoid tissue in the liver is due to J virus. And we also, it appears, were successful in eradicating not only J, but also A and B. So I called John, I told him that. His response was, have you made any progress on salmonella? This was late Friday afternoon. So I said, you could have at least given me the week off. And on Monday morning, or weekend off, on Monday morning, I started working on salmonella negativity for Hubbard Farms. Like the ending of a poorly written dime store novel, however, in the end, Marielle eventually sold Hubbard. There were a lot of hard feelings over the whole thing, and Marielle dumped us as soon as they were able to find a buyer, which turned out to be Grimont over in France. It took quite a few years for that to happen. My arch nemesis, Gregorio Rosales, who actually is a dear friend, but leading the charge for Ross, only Ross handled this completely differently than we did. Gregorio ended up becoming a VP and retiring from Ross. I had pissed off too many people. I hung around for a while and ended up moving back to Pennsylvania, and as Stu told you, did the technical service in broilers and now turkeys for the rest of my career. No regrets, but I didn't end up as a VP for Hubbard Farms. Epilogue. This experience truly is the essence of the statement, the best of times and the worst of times. They told us it couldn't be done. And by God, especially due to the efforts of Dale Woodward, we did it. And we also did it a full year earlier than our initial timeline that we presented to Merck was. I will say I had the privilege of working with the finest team of people I could have ever wished for. I mean, imagine asking people to go tag all these birds and read these tags and kill all these birds. I mean, everybody really rallied to the cause when we decided on a direction and decided to go on it, and ultimately decided to see, we saw some positive results from it. I developed a lot of good and lasting friendships with veterinarians around the United States and around the world. Marshall Putnam from Wayne, he was a reference on my CV. That's how close our relationship came after that. Remember, Merck told me they didn't care what it costs. Well, I'm glad they said that, because the total cost in dollars was $11.5 million to get rid of this virus. In animal lives, we had to kill tens of thousands of birds. It was just the most horrible thing. But I think everybody on the team can look back at this proudly, but I assure you, we don't ever want to go through anything like this again. And with that, I will close this talk.